No torpedo impact, no engine failure. 15,000 tons of steel shuddering against a force that wasn't water. The propeller churned, but the vessel was being held back. The MV Brunswick, a modern tanker. 40 men. They faced 3 assaults in the open ocean. Not from a submarine, but from the abyss itself. Official logs listed it as a collision. Biologists dismissed it. But the marks on the hull told a different story. We know giants exist, yet science fails to explain. What drives a biological organism to hunt a machine of steel and oil? The year was 1930. The maritime world was changing. The age of wooden hulls and wind-driven superstition was dying, replaced by the deafening reliability of the diesel engine. The MV Brunswick was not a romantic vessel. It was a fortress of riveted steel, a 15,000-ton tanker flying the Norwegian flag, designed for one purpose: to move oil across the unforgiving Atlantic North without fear. It was a machine built to ignore the ocean, not to coexist with it. Captain Arne Grunningsæter stood on the bridge, watching the grey horizon that had not changed for days. He was a man of the new century, trusting in charts, schedules, and the rhythmic thrum of the engines beneath his feet. There was no room for sea monsters in his logbook. The Brunswick was too large, too loud, and too artificial to attract the attention of anything living. Or so the manuals claimed. The ocean was calm that morning, the kind of unnatural stillness that makes experienced sailors nervous. The water looked less like liquid and more like a sheet of hammered lead. Below the waterline, the massive propeller blades sliced through the dark, generating a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the entire ship. It was a sound that traveled for miles underwater, a deep, rhythmic pulse that sounded curiously like a heartbeat to anything listening in the deep. First Mate Einar Solberg was on watch duty, binoculars pressed against his eyes. He wasn't looking for mythical beasts. He was looking for debris, ice, or other vessels. The routine was hypnotic. But at 0900 hours, the routine broke. Einar lowered his glasses and squinted at the water on the starboard side. Something was breaking the surface tension. It wasn't the playful breach of a dolphin or the massive rolling back of a whale. It was sharp, deliberate, and moving parallel to the ship. "Debris off the starboard beam," Einar called out, though his voice lacked conviction. The object was moving too fast to be drift. It was keeping pace with a tanker doing 12 knots. Captain Arne stepped to the wing of the bridge. He looked down at the dark water churning against the steel plates. He expected to see a log, or perhaps a lost fishing net tangled in the current. What he saw was a shadow that refused to end. It was long, cylindrical, and possessed a terrifying fluidity. It matched the ship's speed perfectly, as if it were tethered to them. For a moment, the captain considered a submarine periscope, a lingering fear from the Great War. But submarines didn't undulate. This shape was changing, flexing, testing the water around the hull. Suddenly, the water exploded. It wasn't an explosion of fire, but of displacement. A tentacle, thick as a man's thigh and lined with serrated suction cups, whipped out of the ocean. It slapped against the black paint of the Brunswick's hull with a wet, heavy thud that was audible even over the roar of the engines. The crew on the deck froze. This was impossible. They were on a modern steel tanker, not a whaler from the previous century. Captain Arne gripped the railing. He watched as a second arm emerged, then a third. The creature was surfacing. It was an Architeuthis, the legendary giant squid, but it was behaving in a way that defied all biological logic. These animals were supposed to be lethargic deep-sea scavengers, terrified of the surface. Yet here was one, fully exposed in the daylight, attacking a metal wall that it could not possibly eat. The creature didn't just strike, it maneuvered. It positioned itself alongside the tanker, swimming violently to match the 12-knot speed. It seemed to be analyzing the ship. The sailors watched in horrified silence as the animal turned, driving its massive beak toward the steel plates. It wasn't defending itself. It was hunting. "Hard to port," Arne shouted, his voice cracking the paralysis on the bridge. He didn't know if he could outmaneuver a squid, but he had to break the synchronization. The ship began to bank, the deck tilting slowly, but the creature adjusted. It was locked onto the Brunswick. Down on the main deck, a young lookout named Thorstein leaned over the rail, dangerously close to the edge. He could see the creature's eye. It was the size of a dinner plate, dark and intelligent, staring not at the men, but at the ship itself. Thorstein realized something that made his stomach turn. The squid wasn't attacking the crew. It was ignoring them completely. Its aggression was focused entirely on the vibrating, humming metal of the hull. The tentacles sought purchase on the slick steel. They groped for a hold, the suction cups trying to latch onto rivets and welding seams. It was a grotesque dance. The animal was trying to wrap its arms around a victim that was thousands of times its weight. It was an equation that couldn't work. The squid was soft tissue. The ship was armor. But the determination of the attack was absolute. The squid propelled itself forward, faster now, aiming for the stern. It was moving toward the source of the vibration, toward the engine room, toward the propeller. Captain Arne realized the danger instantly. If that mass of muscle and beak got tangled in the screw, it could damage the shaft or bend a blade. A ship without propulsion in the middle of the Atlantic was a disaster waiting to happen. "Full speed ahead! Do not slow down!" he ordered into the telegraph. The bells rang in the engine room, signaling a demand for maximum power. The Brunswick shuddered as the RPMs increased. The water at the stern turned into a white, chaotic foam. But the squid didn't retreat. It seemed enraged by the change in pitch. It shot forward, disappearing beneath the surface, diving directly toward the churning blades. A second later, the ship lurched. It was a subtle impact, a dull, heavy grind that vibrated up through the floorboards of the bridge. The rhythm of the engine didn't stop, but it skipped a beat. A heavy, sickening tearing sound echoed through the hull, like wet canvas being ripped by iron hands. Then, silence returned to the mechanics. The engine stabilized. Arne ran to the aft railing. He looked down into the wake of the ship. The water was no longer white. It was stained with a dark, thick cloud of ink and purple fluid, swirling violently in the turbulence. Pieces of flesh, massive and unrecognizable, bobbed in the foam before being swallowed by the ocean. "Check the rudder! Check the shaft vibration!" Arne barked at the first mate. The crew scrambled. The ship was still moving, but the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. They had just run over a monster. But as the adrenaline faded, the questions began to settle like cold fog. Why? Why would a predator that evolved in the crushing darkness of the abyss swim to the surface to wrestle a steel tanker? It wasn't hunger. You cannot digest steel. It wasn't defense. The ship hadn't attacked it. Later that evening, the chief engineer reported to the bridge. He looked pale, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that trembled slightly. "Captain," he said quietly, "we checked the hull plates near the waterline where it struck first." "Is there damage?" Arne asked. "Not structural, sir, but there are marks, scrapes on the paint, and suction prints." The engineer paused. "But that's not what bothers me. It's the engine, sir." "What about it?" "The frequency we were running at today, the vibration," the engineer said, looking out at the black water. "It's almost exactly the same pitch as the acoustic signature of a distress call from a large marine mammal. A whale." Arne stared at him. The implication hung in the air, heavier than the salt spray. The Brunswick wasn't just a ship to the creature. To the ears of the deep, the 15,000-ton vessel was singing. And the monster hadn't come to eat. It had come to answer a challenge. The logbook entry that night was short. Arne wrote down the coordinates and the time. He hesitated before writing the cause of the delay. He couldn't write "battle with sea monster." He wrote Collision with submerged object. But he knew it wasn't over. The ocean was full of these things, and the Brunswick was still singing its mechanical song into the dark. The evidence did not vanish with the wash of the Atlantic. When the Brunswick finally docked, the proof was waiting on the hull plates, dried by the salt and the sun. Captain Arne stood on the pier, looking up at the towering wall of his ship. Between the waterline and the main deck, there were streaks. Long, erratic bands where the anti-fouling paint had been stripped away entirely, exposing the raw metal beneath. These were not the chaotic scrapes of a collision with drift ice. They were rhythmic, parallel lines of suction scars, arranged in patterns that spoke of deliberate, muscular constriction. Arne ran a gloved hand over the cold steel. The spacing between the sucker marks measured nearly 10 centimeters. He didn't need a biologist to tell him what kind of leverage was required to strip industrial paint from a tanker. The animal hadn't just touched the ship, it had tried to crush it. But the silence from the owners was absolute. The report was filed, the damage painted over, and the Brunswick was sent back to sea. Commerce does not stop for sea monsters, yet the atmosphere on board had changed. The engine's rhythm, once a comforting heartbeat of progress, now sounded like a lure. Every sailor on the night watch found themselves listening to the deep thrum of the diesel pistons, wondering how far that sound traveled in the deep scattering layer of the ocean. It happened again. Not immediately, but the ocean has a long memory. The Brunswick was navigating the same heavy shipping lanes, the same grey expanse between the old world and the new. The conditions were identical: calm seas, high visibility, and the steady 12-knot pace that seemed to trigger the predatory instinct of the abyss. This time, the attack was not a surprise, it was a siege. The lookout spotted the wake first, a V-shaped disturbance cutting across the bow. It wasn't fleeing the ship, it was intercepting it. Captain Arne was on the bridge within seconds. He didn't grab a rifle, he grabbed a stopwatch. He needed to understand the physics of the impossible. The squid surfaced on the port side, running parallel to the ship. It was enormous, perhaps even larger than the first. Its mantle pulsed with a dark, angry red color, a biological warning sign flashing against the grey waves. It didn't strike immediately. It paced the tanker. For 2 full minutes, the creature swam alongside the 15,000-ton vessel, matching its speed knot for knot. It was analyzing the flank of the whale. Then it turned. The attack was precise. The creature launched itself at the hull just aft of the bridge. The thud was sickeningly familiar. But this time, the crew could see the mechanics of the failure. The tentacles wrapped around the curvature of the hull, seeking purchase. On a sperm whale, these serrated cups would dig into blubber and skin, anchoring the squid for the kill. But the Brunswick was smooth, riveted steel. The crew watched in a mix of horror and fascination as the tentacles slipped. The creature's arms convulsed, trying to find a grip, but they slid uselessly against the wet metal. It was a grotesque biological error. The squid couldn't understand why its prey was so hard, so cold, so impenetrable. It struck again, repositioning itself, thrashing against the side of the ship with a fury that shook the railings. "It can't hold on," the first mate whispered, the realization dawning on him. "It's trying to find the throat." The squid, frustrated by the smooth hull, drifted back. It moved towards the stern again, towards the vibration, towards the propeller. This was the pattern. The animal wasn't attacking the hull randomly. It was moving towards the source of the sound, towards the tail of the beast it thought it was fighting. Arne saw the danger repeating itself. "Hard over!" he shouted. "Swing the stern away!" The ship began to turn, a slow, agonizing maneuver for a vessel of that tonnage. The wake curved. The squid, caught in the turbulent water, was forced to correct its trajectory. It lunged for the propeller, its beak snapping at the empty water where the blades had been seconds before. The turbulence from the turn saved the shaft, but the creature didn't give up. It fell behind, caught in the wash, thrashing in the foam. As the Brunswick pulled away, the men on the aft deck saw something that would haunt the logs for decades. The squid wasn't dying. It wasn't retreating in fear. It was following. For 3 miles, the dark shape remained visible in the wake, pursuing the tanker until the sheer exhaustion of the surface chase forced it back into the depths. Back on the bridge, Arne sat down at his desk. He opened the logbook. He had seen the impossible twice. A pattern was emerging, one that defied every textbook on marine biology. These animals were hunting ships. But why only the Brunswick? Why only this class of tanker? He began to review the technical specifications of the vessel. He looked at the engine schematics, the RPM charts, the hull thickness. Then he saw it. The acoustic signature. The Brunswick's diesel engines produced a specific low-frequency vibration at 12 knots. It wasn't just noise. It was a mimicry. To a creature navigating by vibration in the pitch black of the bathypelagic zone, the Brunswick wasn't a machine. It was a rival. It was another male squid, or perhaps a whale, invading its territory. The ship was shouting a challenge into the deep every time it throttled up to cruising speed. The realization was chilling. They weren't just transporting oil. They were towing a sonic lure across the Atlantic. And the ocean was full of things that answered challenges. The third incident didn't happen to the hull. It happened to the psyche of the crew. They started hearing things at night. Not the squid, but the impact. A phantom thud against the plates. Sailors sleeping in the lower bunks below the waterline reported scratching sounds. Sounds of something testing the rivets. Was it the water pressure? Was it the settling of the cargo? Or was it the probing touch of something that had learned from its mistakes? The official reports were becoming harder to write. Collision with submerged object was no longer sufficient when the object had eyes the size of soccer balls. Arne knew that eventually one of them wouldn't slide off. Eventually, one of them would find a way to jam the rudder or shatter the propeller blades. And then, the 15,000-ton fortress would be dead in the water. Silent. And when the engine stops, the whale stops moving. That is when the scavenger feeds. The final encounter was not a chase. It was an interception. The Brunswick was 12 days out of port, pushing through a heavy swell that buried the bow in foam every 30 seconds. The conditions were poor for visibility, but perfect for an ambush. The noise of the ocean masked the approach. Captain Arne was in the chart room when the ship shuddered. This wasn't the rhythmic vibration of the engine or the slam of a wave against the prow. This was a drag. The ship felt as if it had suddenly run into a field of invisible mud. The speed dropped from 12 knots to 10 in a matter of seconds. "Check the screw!" Arne yelled, rushing to the aft deck. The crew was already there, pointing at the turbulence behind the tanker. The wake was a chaotic mess of white water and dark fluid. Something massive had tried to grab the one part of the ship that was moving fastest. The squid had attacked the propeller directly. Perhaps it was trying to silence the voice of the rival. Perhaps it saw the spinning blades as the thrashing tail of a whale. Whatever the biological imperative, it was a fatal error. The bronze blades, rotating at 80 revolutions per minute, acted like a meat grinder. The water turned black with ink, a desperate smokescreen that hid the carnage. But amidst the foam, the sailors saw the tentacles. They were severed, thick as tree trunks, still thrashing in the current as the ship pulled away. The body of the creature, a mantle easily 20 feet long, bobbed once in the violent wash before sinking. The Brunswick didn't stop. To stop was to invite another attack, or worse, to find out the damage was terminal. They limped to port, the vibration in the shaft, now accompanied by a subtle, uneven wobble. The monster was dead, but it had left its mark on the steel. When the tanker finally entered the dry dock in Norway, the water was drained from the basin. The hull was exposed to the air for the first time in months. Captain Arne walked down the stone steps into the pit of the dock, accompanied by a marine insurance inspector and a biologist who had been skeptical of the logs. They walked to the stern. The silence in the dry dock was absolute. There, etched into the anti-fouling paint between the propeller shaft and the rudder, was the story of the battle. The steel wasn't just scratched, it was scoured. The paint had been stripped away in wide circular patches. The biologist stepped closer, pulling out a measuring tape. He placed it against the faint outline of a suction cup mark on the bare metal. 3 inches, he muttered. In diameter. He looked at the captain, the skepticism gone from his eyes. To leave a mark this distinct on steel, the pressure inside that cup would have to be immense. This wasn't a brush, this was a grapple. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the size. It was the location. The marks were concentrated entirely around the stern tube, the exact point where the propeller shaft exited the hull. The creature hadn't attacked the cargo holds. It hadn't attacked the bridge. It had targeted the propulsion. The inspector took photographs. Flashbulbs popped in the damp air of the dock, illuminating the scars. These photos would eventually find their way into the archives of the shipping company, filed under Marine Hazards, Biological. But for the men standing in the shadow of the rudder, the implication was clearer than any report. The Brunswick was a machine. It had no blood, no blubber, no meat. Yet 3 times the apex predator of the deep had risked exposure and death to fight it. The biologist touched the cold bronze of the propeller blade, which still bore a deep gouge near the tip. It wasn't hunting, the biologist said softly, his voice echoing against the hull. It was mating, or fighting a rival male. Arne looked at the massive screw. Explain. The acoustic signature, the biologist replied. The diesel engine, the RPM. To us it sounds like machinery. To an Architeuthis, 12 knots at this specific frequency sounds like the call of another giant squid, or perhaps a sperm whale. The tragedy of the incident settled over them. The monster hadn't died attacking a ship. It had died attacking a phantom. The industrial age had accidentally replicated the language of the deep, and the creature had answered the call with the only response it knew: violence. The dry dock workers began to scrape the hull, preparing to paint over the evidence. The scars would be covered in red lead and anti-fouling compound. The Brunswick would return to the Atlantic. The biologist packed his measuring tape, shaking his head. He knew that what they had found was a revolution in understanding, but it was also a warning that would be ignored. Commerce demands speed. Speed demands engines. And if those engines happen to sing the mating call of a 40-foot predator, that is simply a cost of doing business. The shipping lines would not detune their fleets to save a few squid. They would not alter their schedules to avoid the breeding grounds. The ocean was vast, and the ships were insured. Captain Arne remained in the pit of the dock for a long time after the others had left. He touched the cold steel where the suction cups had been. He realized that the Brunswick was not an intruder in the ocean. It was an imposter. It was a mechanical lie, screaming into the void, provoking a war it didn't understand. The incidents of the 1930s were eventually compiled. Between 1930 and 1933, the MV Brunswick was attacked 3 times. Each incident involved a confirmed interaction with Architeuthis ducks. The official explanation, finally accepted decades later, confirms the acoustic rivalry hypothesis. The squid were not monsters attacking a vessel. They were animals responding to a territorial challenge broadcast by the specific harmonic frequency of the diesel engines. The physical evidence was undeniable. Tissue samples recovered from the propeller and the distinct suction scars on the hull plates proved the aggression was deliberate. But the motive was the key. In the crushing darkness of the abyss, sound is the only reality. The Brunswick sounded like a rival male. It moved like a whale. To the squid, the tanker was alive. Captain Grunningsater's logs became a cornerstone of cryptozoology and marine biology, notably cited in Frank W. Lane's Kingdom of the Octopus. These records forced science to admit that the Kraken was not a myth, but a biological reality with complex behaviors. Yet, the tragedy is that this knowledge came too late for the creatures that died fighting a propeller. The shipping industry absorbed the data, but ignored the moral. They painted over the scars and kept the engines running. The noise of global trade simply grew louder, turning the ocean into a cacophony of mechanical interference. We drowned out the biological signals of the deep with the roar of our own progress. The Brunswick continued to sail, a steel provocateur in a world of flesh and blood, indifferent to the confusion it caused in the dark. Today, we have sonar and silent running modes, but for decades, thousands of ships crossed the Atlantic broadcasting a false signal. We will never know how many vessels were lost, not to storms, but to a misunderstanding. We will never know how many crews vanished because their engines spoke a language they didn't understand. The Brunswick survived because of its tonnage. It was too big to be dragged down. But what about the smaller freighters, the trawlers, the ships that went missing without a distress call in calm waters? They might have been victims of the same error, wrapped in tentacles that were merely trying to silence a rival that refused to leave. The legacy of the Brunswick is not the monster. It is the silence that followed. The silence of the company that filed the photos away. The silence of the ocean that swallowed the evidence. And the silence of the creatures that learned, through blood and steel, that the new whales were not made of meat. If our engines mimic their rivals, how many ships vanished due to a mechanical lie?